hop on and then we will get started. While we're waiting, just some housekeeping stuff. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box, or if anything goes unanswered, don't hesitate to reach out to either Axel or myself. We will share the slides and the recording and a short blog following the session completing as well. And just as a reminder, this is a 6-part series, so there's one more session after this. You can always access anything at any point with the recordings coming out soon after the sessions. So without further ado, we will hop right into this. Hi, everyone. My name is Vidya Murthy. I serve as COO at MedCrypt. Prior to working here, I was working at Becton Dickinson and have done a bit around product security for medical devices for security space for about 15 years now. Axel?
Yes, hi, everybody. I'm Axel Worth. I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at MedCrypt. Prior to coming here, I spent 12 years at Symantec in cybersecurity, specifically looking at the healthcare industry, including medical devices. And prior to that, I spent many, many years working for a variety of medical device manufacturers, mainly in the imaging space, but also a little bit of health IT and health software.
And Axel is being humble. He also wrote multiple books about device security for folks. So if you're looking for a good read, he's got a good one. One of the reasons why this session exists, I think one of the common things is, as we've been talking about in prior sessions, right? Their guidance is not prescriptive by design. There's lots of directions that things could go in. And there's also a lot of gotchas that we've seen folks struggle with. So we wanted to share some of the better practices we've seen because we've worked with a lot of device manufacturers over the years and seen a variety of ways to kind of tackle the challenge that folks face, and some things that work especially good and some things that can position a program to be especially successful. So that's what we wanted to highlight here. As always, please don't hesitate to put questions in the Q&A box if something comes up or if you have a thought or a question in particular. So we'll hop right into it. So I think one of the core things when we think about vulnerability management is it's really more than just the isolated vulnerability in a single instance in a single device. It's a systemic thing that requires a whole program to really support. And kind of the 3 pillars that we see to support this area is having a clear policy to start with, having that be aligned with what your quality management system is asking you to do, and having a very prescriptive communication protocol in place. And with those 3 facets, and we'll go into each of these further as the session continues, but those are kind of the 3 core areas we think you need to start with before you can really proceed any further. Axel, I don't know if you'd add anything there.
Yeah, and I think the points you're making, Vidya, clearly come out of the recently updated FDA pre-market guidance on cybersecurity, where they emphasize really the system side of the problem, right? It's not just merely a device side. FDA really wants manufacturers to understand how the system is integrated into the clinical environment, what other systems are present, could pose a risk to the device, or the device could pose a risk to the other systems. How is the device remotely maintained? How are software patches installed? And. So it is, again, back to Vidya's point, it is no longer a narrowly focused just the device problem. It's really a whole system problem. That's the way the FDA looks at it, and that's the way we as device manufacturers and security specialists should be looking at it.
I would also say that's probably the biggest change in the last 10 years in this space, right? It used to be you're responding to kind of that one idiosyncratic, oh gosh, there's a hacker that got up on stage with my device and they found a vulnerability, or oh, they emailed and we got to deal with this one instance. And moving and shifting from that to something more comprehensive has really been a massive change, I think, over the last 10 years. All right, so starting with developing a formal policy. So some of the core areas for the policy, right? First and foremost is really getting that buy-in from leadership. And I think one of the biggest challenges we've seen pretty consistently, right, is every board at a top device manufacturer says, yes, security is really important to us and we want to do a lot about it. But if you go around the room, there's nobody in the room with security credentials to really speak with gusto about what exactly it is that needs to be done, right? So understanding what top management's expectations of security are married against a security practitioner's day-to-day life isn't always jiving, right? And that's something we consistently see kind of be a challenge and need to be worked through. But if you successfully have top level support, the trickle effect of that is really fun, like foundationally changing how security is done at large device makers. And we've kind of seen, we've seen both, right? We've seen device makers that really have security as a core tenet in how they're approaching product development. We've seen ones where they're saying, yes, we want to take the box, and both have valid pros and cons, but having that justification be consistent all the way up really helps position security differently in an organization. That then translates into the tactical of who's responsible for what and the roles of who's going to be doing what. Given, as Axel alluded to, right, this is no longer just that one device, you really want it to be a comprehensive thing. You have a lot of different functions that have to collaborate to really work through what a vulnerability means to a device and to an organization and how you're going to manage that. And for device makers, we obviously have the QMS, right? A lot of device development is centered around what does the QMS need us to do? How do we proceed with documenting this? How do we populate it and move through the steps of the QMS? If you try to operate vulnerability management independent of the QMS, saying, this isn't something we really need to integrate there, or the QMS out of the box doesn't have it, you will find yourself really duplicating a lot of work and really positioning security to not be as well received by the folks building the device if it's something that's bolted on afterwards, not part of the core way of working. And the last 2 points, I think, align with this idea of guidance, right? And making sure that you're doing what the regulator is expecting you to do. So guidance, standards, having an SPDF, these are all things that are referenced by both the FDA as well as the various policies and frameworks out there that speak to how a device should integrate vulnerability management into the life cycle of a device and making sure that it's clearly defined. Actually, you want to take this one?
Sure. And so to continue the thought here, what are then specific activities and specific processes that medical device manufacturers need to put in place in order to comply with the FDA guidance and very consistently actually with similar regulations in other countries and regions? Threat modeling obviously comes up over and over again as one of the foundational activities, right? It is a established best practice on how to define your system architecture, your design, and assess that design for fundamental vulnerabilities, right? So threat modeling doesn't necessarily look at, let's say, a known CVE in your Bluetooth stack, but it would look at a missing, for example, trust boundary between your Bluetooth communication and, let's say, critical clinical functions. So again, an assessment of the architectural robustness and security of what you're developing. Then the next step is obviously establish a comprehensive asset inventory. It is under FDA very much called an SBOM. FDA is very specific on what they expect on SBOM, what it looks like, what it has to include, and so forth. If you look at other regulations in other regions, it is less prescriptive, nevertheless points in the same direction. For example, in Europe under MDR, they ask for a listing of software soup components, soup being software of unknown provenance, meaning software components you incorporate into your device and they need to be accounted for and need to be monitored. So it's just a different way to express the same process and the same requirement. Then throughout your development process, continual vulnerability scanning and vulnerability testing. But at every integration stage, conduct the appropriate testing, conduct the appropriate scans, conduct the appropriate analysis via an SBOM tool. Monitor external sources for vulnerability intelligence. There are many free and some commercial databases available that give you information on newly discovered vulnerabilities, be it, for example, through the National Vulnerability Database or CSAS-CAF, and other feeds that you can monitor to understand A, what is in my software, and B, what new vulnerabilities have been discovered, either while I'm still going through development or while my device is already out in the market. And then, of course, internal and external reporting mechanisms, right? Establish internal channels so that your employees can report potential vulnerabilities. Yes, you have a tightly controlled engineering environment and testing environment where you have specific processes on how you handle vulnerabilities, but somebody in your manufacturing environment may discover something. Somebody who is peripheral to the actual core engineering team may discover something. A service technician in the field may receive new information from a customer, right? Security researchers may look at your devices. So establish the right mechanisms so that you can, again, constructively take in information about newly discovered vulnerabilities.
And that's probably one of the biggest gotchas that we see in this identification step, is that each of these intakes do not go to like a central assessment point, right? Each intake could potentially be processed by a different group with different criteria, with different expectations, different documentation, and then you end up with very disparate views on like what is actually relevant to our device. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest gotchas I've seen from device makers, is trying to keep these things separate and not trying to harmonize how they all kind of actually work towards the same goal. Uh, so if we think about the identification and techniques that we can apply there, some of the core things I think that we wanted to share is exactly as Axel's alluding to, right? With taking in various activities and harmonizing them into a single spot for assessment. Now, that doesn't mean you have one engineer that knows everything and can assess whether a vulnerability impacts you, but it does mean that you follow the same kind of process for how you take all these inbound identifications and then do something with it, right? So if you think about static analysis or fuzz testing or pen testing, and you say, hey, the results of these things are all disparate, you're probably going to miss kind of what we're trying to say here. You really want these various techniques to come into a same central point so that they all get processed in a similar way, and you have a mechanism for assessing the findings from these that is consistent, and then you have clear next steps coming out of that are consistent, right? So it shouldn't be that one time when you have, I don't know, log4j come up, we have a different way of assessing that than we did with WannaCry, and you should have similar processes for both of those. And I think one of the additional points that we wanted to make here is that it's ongoing, right? This isn't just at the point of time where I release a device into the public, or hey, I have an update to my device. There is a level of ongoing maintenance and monitoring that has to happen as part of best practice to really be able to keep your pulse on what is the healthiness of my device, and how am I applying that same process consistently. And then the last thing I think I would say is you want to leverage existing tools out there. Try to go out there and source all the vulnerabilities that apply is a really hard thing to do. Make sure you have access to databases out there that capture vulnerabilities. Axel alluded to SysAkev, the NVD. There's a whole bunch out there that make it easier to understand. There's also tooling out there that can help you kind of centralize those various databases into a single point of digestion. Prioritization. I think Axel can likely share some good anecdotes here, but one of the hardest things, right, is if you have a device that's running, call it Windows 7, and you have 1,500 vulnerabilities applying to this device. There's so much noise in that it can become really hard to even know what to do. And it can be very disheartening for folks to say, well, I might as well not do anything with this much data. And it's worse for me to know I have a problem on my device, and I'd rather just not know. So one of the core things we think about, right, is how do you have a risk-based strategy here that aligns with your business risk or your patient safety or whatever your strategy is here, right? And I think there are clear criteria that exist out there for prioritization, and that criteria should be well understood by everyone on the team so that you're able to, again, apply that same assessment consistently. And part of that is if everybody agrees on what our criteria are, is you can then do it relatively quickly when something comes out that is in fact requiring action. And part of the design, and the FDA has said this repeatedly, right, is designing devices to ensure that they are patchable, that you don't unnecessarily make patching more difficult and more unsustainable in the long term. Axel, anything you want to add?
Yeah. So one thought to that actually, and that is during the development life cycle of your product, you will discover vulnerabilities at different stages. And in the early development and integration phase, where you, for the first time, test new code that your engineers wrote, or for the first time, link in new libraries, or potentially even use a new version of an operating system you've never used before, the number of vulnerabilities uncovered will be large, right? What that means from a process perspective is that you probably want to have a fairly efficient, but not necessarily highly accurate process, right? You want to be able to process vulnerability at volume, realizing that you may not be 100% right every time. You may fix things that actually didn't need fixing, or you may miss something that should be fixed and leave that to a later stage. But again, because of the high volume, I think focus should be more on efficiency of the process than precision of the process. But then as you get closer to release, and certainly once you're past your final pen testing exercise, and certainly once you're post-market, you have a device out in the field, then your process focus should be on precision rather than volume, because A, you have fewer vulnerabilities, but those vulnerabilities are either about to enter the field or already out in the field, and your assessment better be highly accurate. And therefore, you can afford to put more people on it, assess it more thoroughly, look at the safety implications, look at the clinical implications. But again, you have a lower volume to deal with. So I think there's a different focus of the respective processes you have early on in your development cycle as compared to as you get close to release, and then certainly post-market.
Speaking of post-market, you want to talk about this one a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have certainly plenty of documentation, standards, guidances out there that I think help us and guide us. Obviously, the FDA pre and post-market guidances being the two leading ones. The pre-market guidance was just updated. What is it now? 3 weeks ago or so in June, fairly early on, or fairly quickly, rather updated. Post-market guidance has been with us for now 9 years. We expect an update, but probably more on next year. But having said that, both documents in great detail talk about the process of risk management, vulnerability management, and also prioritization, whether, for example, a vulnerability is or is not safety related, whether a safety decision may impact your software risks and so forth, as it is in great extent actually discussed in AMI TR 57, which is still, I think, the gold standard for how to stand up a risk management process. If you want to get into much more detail in a much more sophisticated approach, you can also look at certainly NIST 800-30, which is not specific to medical devices. It is a general risk assessment framework, best practice, but it does give you a variety of options on how you can stand up your process. But be ready for a degree of complexity as you touch something like NIST 800-30. And then, of course, 14971, the application of risk management to medical devices, not specific to just software vulnerabilities and cybersecurity risks, but they are certainly part of that larger risk picture that is being laid out in 14971.
So if we think about the process, right, once we have this inventory of vulnerabilities we now need to manage, we've come up with our risk-based strategy. How do we then go about remediating and mitigating? I think one of the core things is having a plan for vulnerabilities, having a timeline. thinking about that in your product development lifecycle and how patching for security fits into that. Expectations with customers. If your device is not on a network you control, how do you manage that? If it's not going to consistently connect to the internet, how do you manage that? And having a method for working within those constraints, as well as compensating code and controls. If the answer is, like Axel said, you're not going to mitigate everything every time, right? We're not going to patch every time. What are other controls we can rely upon that could still reduce risk enough to let us continue operating the device safely? And I think one of the core things that the FDA has kind of been showing us, right, is that you're able to show you have a process in place and that it does take the device lifecycle into consideration, meaning over time, once an operating system is no longer being supported by the original developer, how do you cope with that, and how do you have a strategy for mitigating some of those risks? So next section talks about alignment with the quality management system. So one of the core things, right, is I think historically, a lot of QMSs did not explicitly talk about product security in a way that was through the device lifecycle. It would be kind of as you were reaching a regulatory milestone, we would suddenly say, oh gosh, did we do security? And they'd bolt on whatever needed to be done to get through the regulator. What we're seeing now is a much more mature regulator that has expectations of seeing security really being baked into how a device operates over time. And so this means your documentation has to be stepped up. You really have to see security being referenced. I think at a minimum in our best practice, we see about 17 different documents within a QMS that need to have security discussed. And having those then tie into your device, your CAPA process, how you manage risks, the sorts of kind of traditional QMS functions that we know exist. And really making sure that those regulatory and quality folks that you partner with as product security folks understand why security needs to be part of the QMS and how it's mutually beneficial for it to really be baked in and integrated with the device's development and maintenance over time. So Axel, I know you see this a lot, right? One of the hard things about different parts of an organization and how they need to work together. What do you think are some best practices here?
Yeah, I mean, valid point. And yes, unfortunately, we do see a lot of organizational internal disconnects on security priorities. The most mature organizations are the ones that have a executive defined governance approach to cybersecurity for their devices. It still requires work to get it down to the level of each individual engineer that makes the daily design and implementation decisions. But I think that's the best possible path. However, I've also seen scenarios where we've worked with engineers and they appreciate our support in security, but they're also struggling internally selling the value of security up through their management chains all the way to the executive leadership. And as with many things, the world is complex and every medical device manufacturer is different, has a different culture, and has different priorities around cybersecurity. But again, the focus, I think, should be that leadership needs to recognize and make cybersecurity an objective, cross-functional collaboration, right? Because the device you're designing most likely will at some point connect to your own internal IT infrastructure, be it, for example, during production, or be it in the field when your service organization remotes in to deploy a patch or something. So there are many parts within your organization that need to work together, need to understand what their respective requirements and needs are with regards to cybersecurity. So in the end, it comes down to having and developing a security-aware culture and continually monitor your progress, not only the technical progress in terms of monitoring threats and vulnerabilities and collecting metrics on your response, but also establish organizational maturity goals and monitor how your organization improves over time.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we've seen with folks that are especially successful with this over time is they have a dedicated security council that has representation from all these different functions, and that way they can all talk about it at the same time, and they can discuss things like, hey, what we're using for corporate IT is not going to work for our device security, and here's why we have different needs. And it really enables folks to say, we often see politics being played with how security is funded. And I think that's true for product security or corporate security, but the level of complexity sometimes makes the politics even worse with this, right? So you by having kind of a clear decision owner for some of these things, you can have a better chance at clear accountability and resource allocation and getting the things that you need to really build a robust program that will last for the lifetime of a device. There's a lot of harping about communication channels. If not sufficiently underlined by now, really getting buy-in from an organization is critical for folks to be successful here. One of the key things we see right in post-market especially is having that level of communication then go to your customers. So whether it's talking about it in your buying process, whether it's something with your post support that you do with customers, really making sure they understand how they will be supported should something occur is something we're seeing more and more consistently come up. Just recently, we heard of a device manufacturer that was delayed by 6 months selling into a large health system for security considerations alone. It had nothing to do with clinical efficacy. They were really worried, the hospital was worried about what would happen if a device was exploited and how they would manage it. And before they were willing to connect it to the network, that there were a lot of security conversations that had to be worked through with a device maker that was a relatively mature device maker, right, with regards to security. So how you communicate all this hard work that your teams are doing to build a security program is also critical for sales process. Also, seeing integration into the incident response plan, right? So making sure that the incident response plan also feeds into how you manage vulnerabilities is critical, because at the end of the day, right, we talked about this one pile of vulnerabilities that we're managing. Making sure all things kind of come into that same intake valve is really a way to be more successful with management over time. And then, as alluded to, this is not a one and done, it's ongoing. Not only do devices evolve, the universe of vulnerabilities evolves, consumers evolve, that there's a lot of moving and maturing happening. As much, and I hate to be the one to say AI, but AI is really changing not only how we build defenses, but also how attackers are changing their strategy as well. That wraps up kind of the core of what we wanted to talk about here. I guess to end on a bright note, we have seen great success with device makers that really position security as a business imperative, and it positions us in a way to really say security is a business enabler and can make a big difference. And yeah, Axel, I think there was one question if you want to read that one and take it.
Yeah, so question is, in terms of customer communication, how do you determine what to communicate to the customer? For example, when would you let an HDO know about a vulnerability in the system only if the vulnerability is of a certain severity? So the short answer is yes, right? You establish a methodology to assess a vulnerability. And then you establish a threshold that determines a couple of things. I mean, when do you communicate, the degree of urgency with which you communicate, but also then obviously the subsequent patch, right? Do you release it at your regular cadence, every 6 months or whatever your patch cadence is, or do you make it a emergency patch that gets rolled out of band? I think there's some guidance in the FDA regulations there. Certainly, if patient safety is at risk, that requires a higher priority. Certainly, if there are reported incidents of patient harm, that requires higher urgency and immediate response. But there are also variations of the topic. So what, for example, if you host patient data on behalf of your customers for whatever purpose to support their clinical decision making. And what if that database gets breached, right? Then all of a sudden, it's for you as a manufacturer, not just the FDA, but the HIPAA breach notification rule kicks in, and you have to provide notification under HIPAA. Or what happens if your production environment gets impacted by a cyber event? You may have produced devices that were preloaded with malware because something got into your production environment, which unfortunately I've heard from several hospitals as that actually having happened. So at that point, you may have to issue a recall. You may have to, depending on the type of product, issue an alert of potential shortages. If you provide certain pharmaceuticals or consumables that are critical to the delivery of care from a national health system perspective, and all of a sudden your production environment gets shut down and operates at reduced volume, that may require an entirely different set of notifications, right? So there's certainly not an easy and one size fits all answer. And maybe one additional comment, you asked about severity specifically. Certainly severity, certainly likelihood, like how likely is that vulnerability will be exploited. Certainly evidence of already ongoing exploitation. Has one customer reported it? Have 10 customers reported it? But also be aware that if you use common vulnerability scoring systems like CVSS, for example, that is well established in the software and IT spaces. If you need to interpret your vulnerability and your risk in the context of a medical device, in the context of the clinical and safety risks, then CVSS as is may not do what you need to do. You may have to do something that is more complex and more granular and more sophisticated than the relatively simple scoring that CVSS gives you. But CVSS is most likely part of the picture.
Great. I don't see any additional questions, and I think we're actually at time. So thank you, Axel, for joining. For anybody else who has any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can respond to the email when we send out the webinar if you have anything else. And we look forward to seeing you on the next session. Thank you all and keep well.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.